Hello and welcome to our compliance catch-up. We're on episode 4 already. My name is James Hogbin. I'm the CEO of Fingerprint Supervision. We provide compliance automation around communication supervision for regulated firms. And joining me today is someone whose depth of knowledge of the market is so deep and so wide. It's Emma Parry from NovaFin Consulting. Emma, would you like to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. James, thank you so much for the invitation to join you today. It's a thrill to be here. And thank you so much for saying about my expertise. So my background is, as you'd expect, financial services. I've worked for some of the biggest banks on the planet, so the likes of JP Morgan, Citigroup, HSBC. I started out in program management, moved through into COO roles, and then I think most relevant to what we're going to be talking about today, my last one at HSBC, the global head of product governance and conduct risk in a role that spanned global banking and markets. And that was at a time when MiFID II was being implemented, and there were also some rather unusual things going on and arrests and so forth. So like a lot of people who've been in the industry for quite a while, I've had some interesting experiences along the way. It's helped me to frame what I'm now passionate about working on, and also given me the expertise and experience to be able to work with firms, both in terms of banking and sort of regtechs, in terms of helping them understand what happens in the market in terms of misconduct in its very broad sense, and what they can do about it.
And you're much more experienced than me in this whole social media thing. You even have your own podcast, which 13th of February you had
Yes.
the Wirecard, the whistleblower for that. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that? Give us a quick review for anybody that missed the podcast. What were you discussing, who with, and what about?
Yeah, absolutely. So that podcast was hosted by at the ACCA, and it was myself along with, as you said, Pat Gill, who's renowned for being the Wirecard whistleblower. He uncovered significant fraud within Wirecard, which is a fintech headquartered in Germany. He tried to escalate and was ignored. He eventually leaked to the press, to the FT here in London. And then the regulators started to get involved. I mean, it actually kind of ruined his career at one point, but he's actually re-emerged and he's actually launched his own whistleblowing compliance platform. So he obviously spoke about whistleblowing. I spoke about fraud and what we're seeing in the industry in terms of fraud being supercharged with AI. So, a couple of years ago, I was looking at fraud in terms of what we're seeing in terms of market manipulation. So the pump and dump schemes that proliferated during the pandemic. Now, in the space of a couple of years, you can't go onto a social media platform and not stumble across or be targeted by fake accounts, investment scams. I mean, even on, LinkedIn, I've come across investment scams being promoted, and which of course I've highlighted. But you've got to be so careful, obviously. But it also shows that there is more work we can do as an industry in terms of an ecosystem, in terms of implementing regtech solutions that look at, for example, in your case, e-com surveillance, market surveillance, and also what the regulators and central banks are doing in terms of their use of AI. And so those were some of the things I spoke about on the podcast as well. Could talk for hours, as you could
see. A broad range. Let me start at the top there. Didn't PAB actually get sued by the German regulator for bringing the market into disrepute?
They did try that. Yes.
Yeah, they ruined his life. I remember I read the book from the FT guy, and rather than
Yes.
accepting it, the Germans went, "Oh no, this can't be true. You're a troublemaker," and they ruined him. Right? He wasn't allowed
Yes.
back into Germany on pain of, and the FT guy as well got. So it does show
Yes.
that the regulator isn't all that in a bag of potato chips when they decide to take against something.
Yeah. No,
Anyway,
absolutely. That episode's life must have been absolutely horrific. But yes, you're absolutely right there.
there was a very amusing mini-series in German on Netflix called GameStonk, which I highly recommend, which was a takeoff of, Wirestonk, which was a takeoff of the Wirecard fraud. It's dubbed in English, so you don't have to struggle through the German, but it's very amusing. In terms of these pump and dump schemes and the marketing on LinkedIn, where do you see that going? Because obviously there's a whole load of TCF and customer duty type thing going on. And LinkedIn is a bit of a broadcast network. And you do
Yes.
see IFAs and investment managers pretty much advertising on LinkedIn. I'm sure that their compliance department would say it was something else. How would you recommend that people parse what is a good LinkedIn and what is a scam LinkedIn? Obviously, if it had Bitcoin in the name, it's a scam. We know that. But if it doesn't have Bitcoin in, how would you recommend people read them?
Yeah, so you raise a really good question. So if I step back slightly, what we saw during the pandemic is a lot of self-directed trading. So retail customers looking for opportunity, maybe they lost their job, their friends were talking about, the income they were getting through trading online. And so through that, you had a lot of potentially inexperienced traders coming onto the platforms. Regulators got onto that really quickly, some more so than others, I hasten to add, around education. And so one of the things that I loved is a story from the pandemic was the Australian regulator ASIC, which actually infiltrated a chat room on Telegram that was being used for a pump and dump scheme. They actually joined the chat, said, this is ASIC, you're being monitored, and by the way, you're breaking the law. And they are increasingly doing that. So in answer to your question, retail investors must educate themselves. They've got to be doing their due diligence, have a healthy amount of skepticism about what they're reading. If it sounds too good to be true, it more than likely is. And so there's the two aspects. It's regulators taking action and educating. But the investors themselves have a duty to themselves to do some research, and so it's not a one-sided approach.
And do you think that the moral hazard is still there, or the regulators and banks have removed that by effectively recompensing anybody that makes an even slight mistake in their financial lives?
That's a really interesting angle. So I was an expert witness on a court case a number of years ago now, which was around the opt-up of a retail client as elective professional. And the case, and where I was asked to opine, centered on the process that this client went through in the opt-up. And obviously the regulations are very clear about what is required in terms of ascertaining knowledge and experience, and particularly in high-risk products. And the retail client didn't go through a process that I thought was particularly robust. And there were also emails showing that the online broker had induced or sent inducements to this person to encourage them to opt up. So obviously that's a regulatory breach. So this was a couple of years ago now, and regulators, FCA, for example, have written various Dear CEO letters highlighting, these sorts of practices and the fact that they're not regulatory compliant. So are we seeing less? We're seeing probably less of people being duped by investment scams, but what we are still seeing are scams relating to romance, sort of the romance scams, pig butchering. There's a lot of cases coming out about that.
What?
Pig butchering. Oh, have you not heard? Ah, excellent. Okay. So this is an awful expression. It's about scammers. I can't make this any nicer than it is. Basically fattening up their target to scam them. And that's where the pig butchering reference comes from. Yes, there's a woman in the US, Erin West, if I've got her name correct. She is one person who is on LinkedIn all the time talking about pig butchering and tackling it and how that's working in terms of
what would the pathology of a pig butchery scam look like?
So it starts through social media or through a text message on the phone. So again, we've got that link from the social media aspect, and they cultivate people over time. It's not going to be days; it might be weeks or months to fatten them up, get them basically a relationship, and then it turns into either an investment opportunity or a request for money. It goes in either numbers of ways. But what has been discovered is there are offshore centers of scammers who operate these sorts of schemes. And so the ecosystem around fraud in its broadest sense is awful. You've got the social media, you've got your mobile phone potentially, you've got the social media platforms, but then you've got the basic offshore scamming. And the really awful thing is some of the people working in those offshore centers are themselves victims, so have been promised that they'll have a great job in a certain place. They get there and they find that they've basically sold their soul to a scam operation. So it's just awful.
But isn't the end result of the scam, I feel quite sorry for the banks, and I never thought I'd say that. Isn't it just a tax on the stupid, right? The banks are expected to protect these people from themselves because they're just too thick not to fall for what is a Nigerian 419 code scam. And yet they walk away scot-free because they go to the bank and go, you let me transfer all this money to a scammer. You should have known it's your fault. And the regulator sort of, yeah, pay them back. Maybe the easiest way to stop that is just to let it go unfettered. It'll take out the layer of people that fall for it, and then it's burnt itself out, right? Or am I looking at it the wrong way?
It's a very hard approach, if I do say so. So one of the things you've probably noticed that on your, if you're using a banking app on your phone, as I had to make a payment to a new payee a few weeks ago now, and it was quite alarming, but I had to smile. So I set up the payee, I went to make the transaction, and I got bombarded with pop-ups asking me, am I being pressured to make this payment? Am I on a call with somebody who's pressuring me? What's the purpose? Is it crypto related? So on and so forth. So we are seeing those sorts of interruptions in the journey to make people think. So point.
I think that's great, right? And I also like the idea that on an app, your first payment using an app can only be 100 quid. So that if somebody nicks your phone or intercepts the app or the app security isn't great, it can't empty your bank account. I like that. I think that's good security posture. But the ultimate, yeah, I went through all those pop-ups. I did speak to the bank and I still gave my money away and I've lost it. I want it back now. I'm not so sure that's necessarily great for the market per se. But the regulator is very adamant that the safeguard for the retail consumer needs to be absolute. And I just wonder if, looking at some of the more corporate scams, the 1MDB type things, they shouldn't be looking at the bigger dollar value scams in the professional market rather than removing all moral hazard for the retail market.
Yeah, so I absolutely understand. And of course, the UK is one of the leading areas where the payment reimbursement happens. Other countries are looking and wondering how it's going to work. It does look like a tax on the banks for, in your words, the stupidity of the retail investors. I do think there's a need for people to be educated.
Oh, absolutely.
To really
I think
consider
it's
what
of the school education.
Yeah.
I'm looking at my daughters
yes.
who've all been through school, and not one of them has been taught what compound interest is. Not one of them has been taught that a student loan isn't a loan, it's a tax. Not one of them has been taught about how to balance a budget or understand tax, PAYE, all the rest of it. And they've just been ejected out into the world with nothing. They don't know what a stock is. They don't know what a bond is. They don't understand balance payments. It's criminal. Yet RE is mandatory till 16. Go figure.
Yeah.
I'm with you on the education.
Yeah, I find that astonishing, actually, because certainly when I went to school a few years ago now, we learned basic budgeting. How that's absolutely essential life skills. In the same way, you should be taught about food, cook, basic things, and understanding the 5 food groups. I mean, these are essentials that you need as an adult. So yeah, I'm a bit horrified by that. But back to your question, I think I'm slightly concerned that it just becomes a free-for-all, that the retail investors perhaps, continue to make unwise decisions. The banks have to then recompense them, and then basically the fraudsters have got away with it as well. So I think there's a number of angles to it, definitely.
I certainly think if it is fraud, they should be prosecuted, but I'm not necessarily sure the bank should be giving their money back for free. I think there's a connection there. So we've obviously got social media as one of the enablers of fraud. Where do you see the other big areas of fraud within the market at the moment?
So if we look at AI, generative AI and its predecessors, we are seeing fraudsters adapting to the use of AI really quickly. So you've basically got turbocharging of fraudulent activity, and that can take a number of different forms. I guess one area is, are they using AI to manipulate the market, maybe through use of an algo, through potentially an online brokerage firms, as an example. So I think AI in itself shouldn't be a bad thing, but it's the way it's utilized and who is using it. The other aspect to that is whether the AI that is being used is being trained on good quality data, and there's been quite a number of articles written about that. And there was an example, and I've got to share it with you and the listeners today, that there was thankfully in a research and development environment, an AI bot that was given a scenario, and the scenario was that company had financial troubles. It was given information about a potential deal that was private, so inside information. The AI bot was told that insider trade is illegal, and then they let it loose in this research environment. And lo and behold, the AI bot decides to do some insider trading. So it knows it shouldn't do it, but even worse, when questioned, did you do some insider trading, it denied it. So I am really concerned about what is happening in terms of the AI environment. We've got criminals using it. We don't know that we can really trust it. And yet, is it really being regulated? Not yet. So I think from my perspective, I think that's one of the key areas that I'm looking at is, how quickly can we get something in place that from a regulatory standpoint, but also the due diligence that firms must be doing to understand the outcomes of their AI systems as well.
And to me, it's interesting that the regulator has taken quite a strong stance on AI in our area, comm supervision, in the fact that they need to tie decisions to a human being, a code staff member, an SM and CR type person, because they're ultimately responsible for the decisions that are made in terms of supervision and monitoring and that sort of thing. And obviously that means you can't use AI because AI is a bunch of if statements. It's basically wrong all the time. It's not repeatable. I have a very low opinion of AI. I don't think it's going to be our overlord. I think it's just a interesting parlor trick. But that aside, it's not repeatable. It's not predictable. You get different results out because it's fuzzy logic and probability densities rather than anything provable. And so it's almost impossible to use as a decision-making tool in the compliance process. Yet, on the other hand, the regulator is making a big play because if you slap AI in your name, everybody thinks you're... the phrase I was going to use there, I can't use with loads of things, but everybody thinks you're great if you put AI there. And the regulator is crowing about their use of AI. And that is a huge dichotomy to me because compliance people can't use AI because they need to be tied to a person in terms of the responsibility. And if they're trusting AI, they don't understand the responsibility principle. Yet the regulator themselves are saying, isn't AI great? We should foster more use of this, but not in our rule book. And what's your opinion on that area of AI? Because obviously...
Yep. No, absolutely. So, wow, that's quite a loaded question. Let me tackle that in a couple of different ways. So, one, you've
slag the regulator off. They don't watch us.
Excellent. Okay.
So they did reach out to us once, actually, interestingly, and said, "What does your system do?" And we said, "This is what it does." And they asked us about AI, and I ran them through why AI didn't work. And I said, "You do agree with that, don't you?" The regulator said, "Oh yes, we do agree with that." I was like, "Can you write something that says you agree with that?" "Oh no, we couldn't possibly guide the market." No. You're the regulator. Tell them what's... Anyway, let's not go there. They make me very frustrated. Sorry, Emma. I cut across completely with my frustration with the blinking regulator. Useless.
That's fine. This is obviously a good counselling session for you.
Yeah.
So you've hit the nail on the head in terms of the way in which the regulatory landscape is becoming more complicated. So we've got now the intersection of, to your point, the AI outcomes with SMNCR, and then link into that consumer duty if it's a retail customer. And so the landscape itself is becoming increasingly difficult. Your point about regulators and even the central banks using AI is very well made, because they are. And it's actually changing the dynamics of the conversations, to your point, around, a number of years ago when I sat across from the FCA, there was almost this sort of weary recognition that we were surviving on spreadsheets for certain things. That dynamic has changed. They are asking the questions, are you using AI and what for? And so, you know, the view of, and the advice that I'm now giving is, if you're not using AI, that's fine. You just need to be able to explain how your system works and how you are comfortable with the outcomes. And, you know, AI is necessarily for everybody, right? So I think the other thing I'm deeply suspicious of is when people say they're using AI, but actually, are they? Is it a, you know, this is going to sound a bit awful, but is it an offshore team using spreadsheets with the fabrication of the fact that it's AI?
The
It happens.
reality. Yeah.
Exactly. And so I am slightly suspicious of, you know, the terminology being used and whether it is actually the truth. But I am a deeply suspicious person about certain things. But the point around it changing the dynamic of the conversation is an interesting one, because you need to be able to sit in front of the regulator, which is not always a very comfortable position to be in, and justify what you're doing. To your point, they will never, you're never going to get a stamp of approval from the regulator. They're never going to say, yes, we approve what you're doing. That's not the way they operate, certainly not in the UK. And so it becomes that dialogue of, we're doing this is how we do it, and this is how we're comfortable with what we're doing. And by the way, you know, we're a successful business with clients, and we are following what the regulations need us to be doing in terms of functionality. So in your case, e-com surveillance.
And this, to me, is the entire problem with our opaque regulatory system. We know through them telling us that they had 380 odd supervision cases last year. We don't know what in, we don't know what about, we don't know which areas. And obviously the compliance consultancy industry will all claim to be involved in some investigation or other, and that's driving, and the focus of the FCA is obviously this, and look, there's 300 of them, and just imagine if you were one of the... It's all rubbish. We don't know what the FCA is doing. We don't know what they find important. They pop up at conferences and blah on opaquely about nothing, basically. And it leaves the market not knowing where the focus is, right? If they said, we've got 380 things, of which 25 were mis-selling, 45 were inappropriate product placement, a whole load of AML, and then a few bad process, then you'd be able to go, okay, we understand what we have to do. But right now, there are squillions of rules across loads of rule books, which you have to interpret as to whether you're doing or not. And then you don't actually know what happens until they knock on the door and say, by the way, this is an opt-up case. I think that's an incredibly bad way to run a market. In the US, there are rules. You hit the rule, you don't hit the rule, right? And they turn up and go, there's the rule, you hit it, you didn't hit it. And we're publicizing that. We've gone into 1,800 firms, of which 1,700 hit the rule, 100 didn't, and we find them. And you know where they're investigating, what their examinations are about, and the rest of it. And it means that effectively your compliance is more robust because you understand the thematic driver of the market, because the regulator is telling you what the thematic driver of the market is. Whereas here, no clue whatsoever. I think it's utterly remiss of them.
Yeah, it's really interesting because you're right. I mean, here it's principles-based outcomes. Can you prove the outcome? The US is very much a legal approach, to your point. It's really interesting. There's been a lot of cases, freedom of information cases, going into the FCA here to try and get to a better sense of what's going on, to your point, to get through the opaqueness. They haven't been very successful from what I've seen. So I do think
the FCA used to have an FOI register, that used to list out all of the FOI requests they got from various people giving out information. The last time they updated that was 2022. And since that, the only FOIs they put on are the diaries and the expenses of the board members. So, and I've put an ICO request in, say, where is this data? Is it not being held at the FCA anymore? Is it being held at you? Because there used to be a rich seam of shared data that they've completely clammed up on now. And it used to be quite useful. What are you investigating? What thematics are you looking at? And the rest of it. And you might not have been interested in what the question was, but you got some sense of where the FCA was going by what other people were asking them and how they were answering the questions. For 2 years, not a single update other than trivial stuff about diaries and expenses. So I think they're trying to hide the fact they don't know what they're doing by being deliberately opaque on FOIs.
Yeah, interesting. And of course, what they do publish is very backwards looking. So the market watches, the thematic reviews, it's ancient history by the time it's publicized. And of course, the FCA
find out from the FCA how many people they regulate in which sectors. They go to the register. Well, the register doesn't tell you. You can pick out firm by firm by firm. So how many credit brokers do you regulate? How many asset managers do you regulate? How many broker dealers do you No, can't get that information. Doesn't exist. Well, it does exist in the register, but you have to search every firm. And the old days, somebody would have asked an FOI request on that about once a quarter, and they'd publish the information in the response to the FOI. But like I said, last 2 years, none of it. Don't know. Black box.
Wow. Plus the turmoil that they've had in terms of morale and the first ever strike. I think it was the first ever strike. So, they've clearly got some challenges, cultural challenges as well, which is slightly disconcerting when they are supposed to be looking at the financial services industry as a whole and promoting the fact that culture is so important.
Yeah. And if you've ever strolled into retail as a sector, they're up in arms about how much they have to pay. They see the FCA as a direct. In the wholesale market, there is a degree of respect for the regulator. In the retail market, none whatsoever. They see them as a huge financial drag on the business with no value add whatsoever. And it's interesting to me that a lot of the wholesale market get due diligence reports that tick back to the FCA rules and go, look how regulatory compliant we are. Whereas in the retail market, they will do whatever it possibly takes to kick back against the regulation. It's a chalk and cheese type thing. It's fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. So just on that, while we're talking about retail banks in particular, one of the things that I found particularly disconcerting was the interest rate scenario. So obviously interest rates have gone up and the mortgages went up very, very quickly indeed as a result. But the interest rate on saving accounts and even ISAs, sluggish, very much behind where the mortgages were. So you have an inequality in terms of those people with mortgages versus those people who are lucky enough to have savings, and the banks basically getting away with it as well.
But they've got to make some money somewhere because they have to give all the money back to people that are too stupid to read a risk warning, right? So at some point, because we demand free banking here. Again, if you go to the States or France or anywhere else, you pay for your banking relationship, and things move more in lockstep. It's not completely in lockstep, but it's better. Whereas here we have this perceived free banking, and banking isn't free. There's a huge architecture behind payments and used to be behind checks and all the rest of it. And they're not allowed to sell us inappropriate financial instruments any longer, so they can't make any money from that. So what do we do? Because if a bank turned around and said, servicing you as an individual costs us 170, 180 quid a year, that's your charge, there'd be all sorts of ructions. And yet, the moment there's a delta between an interest rate and a savings rate, everybody's shocked. No, it's free, right? That's...
Now we're into the territory of where banks exit customers. So the Nigel Farage scenario.
Customer, don't they? There isn't a universal banking obligation. The government could quite easily write a universal banking obligation if they wanted to, but as they don't have one, I'm pretty sure they're commercial organizations. And as we're seeing also at the top end with the Morgan Stanley Fraser's relationship, they can, even at a eligible counterparty level, a bank can say, we don't really want to deal with these people.
Yes.
So I think it's all right, isn't it? I don't know. I think culturally is a wrong thing to offer somebody, but there are commercial organizations, there are other commercial organizations. The trouble is, if you're kicked out of a bank, you're kicked out of banking, which is wrong.
Yes. It's interesting actually, because I have been involved in risk type statements, but also sort of client selection or client deselection, which is what we're talking about now. And it's very much around how that process works, and that it is a respectful and transparent, as much as it can be, the discussion around, to your point, the economics of a relationship. Running a relationship, and particularly if, say, the customer is a higher risk, but the income that the bank is getting is a lot lower than it potentially has been, then yes, that is definitely a discussion. Definitely a discussion to be had.
To this discussion, I'm uncomfortable with the way that Nigel Farage was debanked on a cultural issue because it made no difference to the economics. But if they turn around and said, listen, Coutts has you've got to have a 2 million quid basic liquidity in your current account and you can't really argue with that. But if he then put in the extra money to make it 2 million, there should be no reason to debank him. You can't go around and go, I don't like your color, I don't like your sex, I don't like your religion, I don't like your race, to debank somebody. That's racism. That's wrong.
Absolutely.
But on a financial thing, if you've got a financial criteria that says you've got to have X to do this, or we need to see this much business off you, or not. Now, the downside to that is the moment you're ejected from a bank, no other bank will touch you. And I think that's, again, it's a regulatory issue, maybe, that the regulator should say, listen, if you're debanked, on what basis are you debanked? Because if you're debanked on a financial thing, then sure, you can go to a lesser financial required bank. But if you were debanked for money laundering, you're probably debanked.
Yes.
But
yes. And you'll have people following you and trying to put you in prison.
Absolutely. Which is that. So tell me about your journey from big bank into consulting. How did that happen? How's it going? Where are you seeing clients happening and turning up, and what are you servicing and that sort of stuff?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you for that question. So how it happened was that I got to a point in my career after, well, a number of years in banks, and thinking that that's kind of the time where I want to do something different. And if it wasn't going to be then, it may never happen. So I decided that it was time to do something else. So I set up my own firm. That was now 6 years ago. And it's been great. I get to do things like this, which I love. I can talk for hours, as you know. But I'm working with all sorts of different types of clients, which I'm finding fascinating. So some of the work I've been doing has been with traditional banks. So I had done, for example, risk assessments, so second line risk assessments for a global bank, looking at conduct risk, obviously. And I have been working with RegTechs in terms of things like marketing content, product positioning, helping to, I guess, giving insights in how to navigate the large global banks and how it works in terms of procurement and all that sort of good stuff. I've been doing a lot of writing, so I'm published with Thomson Reuters. I've done some articles with Regulation Asia. I've done some work, as I've mentioned before, with law firms, so as an expert witness. So it's been a very interesting journey, and I'm building out a portfolio career, essentially, and I'm having some discussions. I can't give you any more details right now about a NED opportunity as well. So, there's as much as people don't like LinkedIn, I found it an absolute blessing. Lots of the work that I'm getting is through LinkedIn. I mean, people might think I'm on there a little too often, but there's so much in terms of interesting, mostly free content, the opportunity to network with academics, with people in the industry more generally in terms of in banking, fintechs, regtechs, there's, opportunities galore. So my advice to people setting up is get onto LinkedIn.
Fantastic. And where does NovaFin come from? Where's the story behind the name?
So I have to, the credit has to go to an ex-partner of mine, actually. He came up with it. We were bouncing around ideas when I sort of set up the company, and I had a blank about what to call it. So Nova, sort of supernova, Fin, financials, it kind of just came together that way. Yeah, so I stuck with it.
Fantastic. And
but not the
with
man.
the clients that you've got, what themes do you see developing in the market for 2024, a couple of month and a half in? Where do you see this year going? What's your
yeah, so there's a number of areas. The intersection of regulations, I think that's causing some headaches and a few tears as well, because people are getting a bit confused on how to make that happen, at what level of the organization, what does the board need to see and understand, what needs to happen further down. So yeah, the regulatory intersection piece. As I've mentioned, fraud, big challenge, lots of conversations going on around that, both in terms of some of the basic controls, but also what RegTech opportunities are there that they can utilize, and also understanding what's happening across the ecosystem, so they're aware of the scenarios. So it's an awareness piece as well. So the fact that you hadn't heard of pig butchery is a good example of the fact we need to do more promotion and awareness around what is happening, the scenarios that are continuing to evolve. I think the other thing is around as I mentioned, what the regulators and the central banks are doing. So how they're using AI to monitor what's happening in the market, how that then translates and changes the dynamics of the conversations. So some of the people I've been working with have been around, how do you have a conversation with the regulator? And what sort of things are they going to be asking me? How do I prepare for those discussions? So there's a little bit of that. I think also there's, as much as we've spoken about the FCA, there's so much happening with digital sandboxes as well. So if you are in the RegTech space, there are opportunities to test out your product in a sandbox using, sort of the data that's, I can't think of the word, manufactured data. So you can then test out the outcomes and so forth. So I think 2024 is going to be, it's a year of innovation, obviously. I think it's also a year of dramatic change. Let's not forget the number of elections going on this year. And so there's concerns around election fraud, market manipulation that may happen on the lead up to elections. And so, again, this is about controls, understanding these events and what needs to be in place. So, frankly, there's a lot going on. There's a lot of discussions with all the different players in the ecosystem.
And where do you think the regulators themselves are focusing at the moment? We hear a lot about central bank digital currencies, consumer duty in the UK, in the US. We know what the investigations are, but where do you think the regulators are really pointing at the moment?
So I try and take a pointer from what the regulators publish in terms of their priorities. That's a good starting point. And to your question, social media, investment scams, awareness campaigns, but also being more proactive. So as I mentioned, the ASIC disruption tactic is being promoted through IOSCO as a good thing for regulators to do. So I'm slightly concerned that the regulators have been too broad in what they're focusing. And, even with some of the regulators mentioned ASIC, their priorities were listed out in bullet points in basically one slide. So it's difficult to really know until they come knocking on your door. Yeah.
And obviously the FCA has put diversity, inclusion, and whatever the other bit of that is at the top of their agenda. Do you think that's an appropriate thing for a regulator to be doing in regulating a market?
Here we are. So DEI.
What do they stand for? Diversity, exclusion, and I don't know, indicate.
Equity and inclusion.
Oh, so it's got something to do with the markets then, at least.
No, absolutely. So I'm interested in it because some of the research that sits behind why a regulator would be interested in this. And some of that research points to the fact that if you have a diverse board or senior management team, your business will do better. And there's research that stands behind that. So why the regulator would be looking at this is because they want healthy, well-run markets and for companies to thrive. I mean, ultimately, and of course, we saw the FCA being focused in this direction around supporting competition and growth of the economy as well from the government. So I can kind of see where it's coming from. And there is research, as I said, that suggests that those companies with greater levels of diversity are doing better. So that's where I think it's coming from.
And do you think it's appropriate that they're making it a focus of the regulatory regime, that's a priority for companies to achieve, given a marketplace? Is that appropriate for a regulator as opposed to the shareholders of each individual business to decide the best way for the capital to be allocated within the business?
So the other angle on this and why the regulators are looking at it is the cultural aspect. And so what has potentially been an issue in terms of misconduct in the industry in the past is where you have a lack of diversity. So there's a lack of challenge in terms of, maybe taking on new business, in terms of the way the business is being run. And so that will be the other angle. So I think it's right that regulators are looking at what levels of diversity sit within firms. I think it does.
Is that not a GRC issue rather than a DEI issue, though?
No, I think it's labelled correctly. Because the other angle here is around cognitive diversity as well. So you want people in the decision making that have a diverse level of experiences, of skill sets, to thrive. And I think it's right that regulators are looking at it and have it as one of their agendas. I'd be interested to understand what the DEI statistics of the FCA are, though, because again, to your point, is that published? I don't know. I've not ever looked, but
I'm
that's
sure
the
it must
angle.
be that they're very big on that, as opposed to GRC, which is probably what they should be focusing on, given the fraud and the mis-selling endemic in the market, which is more about government risk and control than, I would argue, diversity, inclusion, and equity. But hey ho, I'm not a regulator. What would I know?
But
and in terms
it shows. So I was just going to say, it shows the intersection of so many of the topics and obligations that firms need to get their head around.
Yeah, I'm generically uncomfortable with the regulator stepping into a business role. They're there to create an orderly market and create the rules around who can do what, where, and how. And I think shareholders of businesses are there to maximize the investment that they have in that business, whether they choose to do that ethically, unethically, with a diverse employment pool or a restricted employment pool. That surely is a participant focus to do with company law rather than a regulatory requirement to do with the marketplace. I don't, in my mind, get it. I can see the argument for GRC, i.e., you have to separate responsibilities and you have to have committees that discuss that and checks and balances, and you have to have good risk control and the rest of it. Yeah, I think that's probably as far into an organization as a regulator needs to go. And then dealing with fraud, right? Because they need to say what is and isn't appropriate.
Yeah, no. But if we look at the Wirecard example that we spoke about at the top of the discussion, and the challenges that Pav Gill had in terms of getting people to listen to him and his concerns of what he uncovered, would that have been different if the firm had a greater level of diversity, a greater level of cognitive diversity within it? And that's really the angle that I think is the regulator's purview.
Yeah, but again, it was a fraud, right? And that's nice. Are you an ethical fraud? Oh, that's all right. Don't worry about that. You've got the right mix of people, and you've got the right, I don't know, logo on your LinkedIn profile. That's all right. You're an ethical fraud. Off you go. I think more of that was the governance, risk, and control of the regulator itself, because the regulator didn't want to listen. The regulator was given document after document after document saying this is fraudulent. It's some tiny phone shop in the back of, where was it, Thailand or wherever, that they put 90% of their Asian business, that was supporting the entire thing, and the regulator did not want to listen. And that, I think, was a massive failing of one of the biggest regulators in Europe, that was captured by government in terms of, this is a good, strong German company, why would you be looking at it? And I don't think that could happen in the UK. I think the regulator is much more independent of the government than BaFin is of the German government. And the whistleblower regulation doesn't seem to work in the NHS, but hey ho. So we've got about 5 minutes left. What would you, if you look back on this year in February next year, where would you define success for you this year?
That's a really good question. So if I look at this from a very personal perspective, this year is very much about continuing to build my brand around being even more precise about areas that I'm working on, how firms, be that regtechs or banks or fintechs, and continuing to grow my portfolio. So as I mentioned, in discussions around a NED role, and I'm also continuing to have some conversations around content and consulting. So it's really, from a personal perspective, building out that portfolio that keeps me challenged, that keeps me interested, because that's what you know, why I'm bound out of bed in the morning is the passion to do interesting things. And that was, to be fair, one of the reasons why I decided I needed to set up my own firm, because I didn't feel as satisfied with what I was doing than when I had initially embarked on my career within the financial services firms themselves. Running my own company it can be a bit fraught, but it's exciting as well. So this year is about continuing to build on that, building out the network, doing more podcasts.
Perfect. Well, I will invite you back on the 21st of September, February 2025, and you can let me know whether that worked or not. If we can get into your schedule when you're the Ned of some enormous thing, or even worse, the Ned of the regulator after I've just spent half an hour slagging it off. That would be awful.
I won't solve.
Brilliant. Emma, thank you very much for today. I've thoroughly enjoyed our chat, and I look forward to following your inevitable success. What is coming up in the next few weeks for you? Have you got any more webinars, presentations, anything like that planned, or are you?
Oh, yes. So I've got a few more podcasts coming out. They're going to be on LinkedIn. So for my avid followers, you'll find them on my feed. And like I said, the NED discussion, I've got some ideas of some articles I want to write as well, touching on some of the things that we've spoken about as well. So watch this space.
Well, we will promote them from our LinkedIn as and when they come out.
Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you again for the invitation to be here. It's been an enlightening discussion.
Yeah.
And watch out
so much for me being a regulatory compliance consultant. I hate the regulator. There you
go. Watch out for the pig butchering.
Yeah, I will do. Okay, Emma, thank you very much indeed. And we'll speak soon.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thank you.